I guess I wanted to just welcome you all. Bienvenue à tout le monde. We are really glad so many of you joined us today for our very first community call related to OERs that's brought to you by the OEWG, the Open Education Working Group. I guess we see this as a chance to strengthen the developing community of practice in Canada around OER. We also wish to recognize that this community is bilingual. And so although we realize much of this conversation will be in English, we absolutely welcome French contributions and questions at any point during this call. Alors, je vais mentionner rapidement, nous sommes tout à fait conscients que cette communauté des ressources éducatives libres est bilingue. Nous voulons absolument souhaiter la bienvenue aux francophones qui sont avec nous aujourd'hui. Sentez-vous libre de faire des commentaires en français si vous le voulez. Posez vos questions en français. On est tout à fait capable de vous répondre et de vous inclure, et ça nous fait plaisir d'ailleurs. A couple of quick words about the Open Education Working Group. This is a working group that was formed by Carl in 2019. It's chaired by Joy Kirchner. But I also want to point out that it would not have been able to do everything that it has done so far without Erin Fields, our fantastic visiting program officer for OER. So I'm going to move to this next slide here. So my name is Lise Brin. I'm a program officer with Carl, and I'll be facilitating this today with Ali Versluis. Do you want to introduce yourself, Ali?
Sure, yeah. I'm the Open Educational Resources Librarian at the University of Guelph.
And so these are the themes that we're going to be discussing today. We basically have a slide for each of these, and we'll be posing some questions and hoping you contribute your knowledge, your experiences. We certainly are not seeing this as a session where we are going to provide answers, or certainly not all of the answers. Certainly, Ali and I are not going to be providing the answers. We have lots of questions and some feelings and some thoughts about these things, but we really want to hear from you. We've heard from a number of colleagues that some searching for OERs can be frustrating, complicated. So I guess we want to see what are your experiences and thoughts, and a little later in the call, talk about how we as a community can make some changes and improve the situation. All right, so I think from there, I'm going to pass it on to Ali to get started with some questions for you.
Oh, cool. So before we get started, we just wanted to get a bit of an idea who is in the room. So if you can all go to your Zoom platform, at the bottom of the screen there's an option that says participants. If you make sure that that's clicked, you should see all the folks on the right-hand side of the screen there. And hopefully you'll see a little, you can click the chat little bubble there as well. And once you have both of those things enabled, we're just gonna ask, we want you folks to raise your hand. So there should be an option to raise hand. It's above, at least on a Mac, above the chat, but below the participants, there's a little gray button. There's 3 there. One is raise hand. So hopefully you folks can all see that. So, oh, excellent. I'm seeing some hands raised already. Excellent, excellent. If you could unraise your hand for a second there, that would be great, but glad to see so many people have found the button and know how it works. So we just wanted to get an idea how many folks on the call are librarians. So if you could raise your hand if you're a librarian, that'd be awesome. Just taking a look here. A lot of librarians. Well, that's always good to see. Number of folks who either haven't found the raise hand button or don't fall into that category. That's cool. But looks like about 2/3 of the group. And who is a, if you put your hand out again, who is an instructional designer, educational technologist, someone that works in a teaching and learning office? Oh, there is a couple folks in there. Awesome. Glad you folks have joined us. And lastly, we're just curious if anyone in the room is a what we're calling kind of a content creator. So that could be a faculty who's creating OER, or if there's any students in the house, we'd love to see that represented as well. So if you are a content creator, but also those of you who are instructional designers or librarians are content creators as well. So if you feel like that label is attached to you, feel free to throw up your hand there. Okay, pretty good mix here. Mostly librarians, instructional designers, educational technologists. So not super surprising in my experience, but I'm glad to see folks coming from a number of different places on the call. Alrighty, so we'll get started and jump right into the questions here. Lise, if you go to the next slide. Oh, perfect. Okay, so the first kind of prompt that we have for you folks is really focusing on kind of the search experience. So how would you characterize your experiences with searching for or finding OER? So feel free to unmute if you want to talk. You can throw it in the chat if you feel more comfortable with that. It's all good. Time consuming, yep. I feel that. Fragmented. Incomplete. I'm curious what you mean about incomplete, Dana. Just the resources themselves, or can you say a little bit more about that? Wondering if I'm missing a place to search. Time consuming, overlap for sure. Yeah, some of the repositories, lots of duplication. See a number of folks raising that as an issue. Never sure you've done a good search.
Yeah, that sounds familiar.
So real, so real. Even when you're lucky enough for that to be your entire job, I'm still like, did I miss something?
Difficile et laborieux, so yeah, definitely difficult and challenging. Takes a lot of work.
Fairly easy to find if you're searching for textbooks, open courseware, but difficult when you're searching for lesson plans or more discrete resources. Yeah, if you're just looking for kind of a small thing to just plug in, it can be much harder to find that for sure.
So we have a question, Ali. We're being asked what our definition of OER is, and if we mean simply that it can't be modified or more widely. Alors, je suis en train de regarder la question de Pascal. Alors, comment on définit les REL? What's your definition, Ali? I guess we didn't get into that at all.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I guess we hadn't really thought about kind of a definition for the purposes of this question, but if someone is kind of asking me what my definition of OER are, usually tend to say educational materials widely understood. So textbooks, simulations, modules, really anything that can be used in the classroom that are freely available and openly licensed in a way that allows them for use and reuse. So thinking specifically about kind of that opportunity for revising, remixing, building upon things, but also recognizing too that sometimes kind of open content, folks who are applying a more restrictive Creative Commons license. I mean, there's lots of discussion in the community about if there is a less open license, is that truly an OER? When I'm supporting faculty, I usually just say an open license writ large. I'm not as invested, I guess I should say, in having the capacity for revising, remixing, and adapting it as well, as long as it has kind of a CC license or it's able to be used kind of free of charge, so freely accessed and openly licensed in some way.
Okay, I'll say that in a few words in French for Pascal. Alors Pascal, je ne sais pas si vous avez compris, mais et pour les autres. Donc, on parle de ressources pédagogiques qui sont gratuites à utiliser, donc pas de frais d'utilisation, mais qui sont aussi rendues disponibles sous licence ouverte. Et c'est là qu'il y a toute une variété de licences qui peuvent être appliquées, mais en général, on s'attend à ce que la licence permette la réutilisation et, si possible, évidemment, repackager, non, je n'ai pas le bon verbe, de remixer ou combiner des différentes sources ouvertes. Je ne sais pas si ça répond à votre question.
Thank you, Lise. You're amazing. Yeah, some great comments here in the chat too. Confusion between open access resources and OER, challenges around how folks kind of conceptualize OER and kind of making sure that you are, you know, I think if a faculty member comes to you and says, I want to use OER, part of that conversation also has to be making sure they understand what that is, because they may have heard about it in some way, but don't necessarily have the full context for what that means. Yeah, some confusion in the resources too. So even some open repositories have free resources. We're getting at that free comment, that potentially open access side of things, but not necessarily that those options for revision or remixing. So yeah, it sounds like this is very validating. Many of you have the same experiences as I do. So yeah, so hard for upper level courses and more specialized, much easier to find kind of general intro things. Yeah, and I think there's a lot of at least in my experience, a lot of folks think of OER and they think of open textbooks, and those have gained a lot of traction stateside, certainly. And I think a lot of that is because there is kind of a lot of open textbooks for those first and second year courses, you know, chemistry or US history or those kind of big courses, but less so for kind of the most specialized things that may not be offered at every campus, for sure.
Can anyone hear me?
Yes, but you're very quiet, Erin.
Oh, well, that's rare.
Yeah.
Is that any better?
Yes, yeah, you're good.
Okay, perfect. I thought I'd be brave and talk. What I wanted to mention is that I agree with everything that's been said about the finding piece, but I wanted to mention that the finding deeply impacts the advocacy piece and getting buy-in from faculty to engage, because if the searching is unsuccessful, and not necessarily because resources aren't there, but because it's just deeply hard to do, faculty are less open to the notion of actually looking through the content that is found, which then makes it such an uphill battle. Like if we can't even make it easily accessible to find the stuff, then trying to get people on board with using the content is so much harder.
Yeah, totally. I see there's some agreements in the chat, and I was thinking the same thing. If librarians who do this day in, day out are getting frustrated, then faculty who might be new to this or might be looking for something quite specific in a specific, you know, branch of their discipline are likely to be even more frustrated. I think we might have another question on this page, don't we?
Yeah, we definitely have more questions.
Should I open this up a little?
Yeah, sure, go for it. Yep. And yeah, some of you already mentioned this in talking about specific kind of disciplines, but we're really interested in hearing your perspectives on how easy or challenging you might think it is to assess the breadth of what's available in a particular discipline. So if some of you might be liaison librarians supporting folks in particular kind of subject areas, we'd love to hear from you. So we'll start off with that question.
Well, it's not easy. We already know that. But I do want to mention, when you're talking about the versions are very frustrating as well, especially because I don't think that when people take something, adopt it and adapt it, there's no standard approach on how to indicate additions. Like publishers know how to do this when it's 2, 3, 4, they add the metadata appropriate so that you know what edition it is. But that's not happening. What I'm finding is people are maybe changing the title slightly, or they might put in the title, you know, Chemistry 101 2, edition 2 or 2E or something like that. And that's deeply frustrating, because then I'll send the faculty members all of the options for the open textbooks, and not being a subject specialist, I can't tell that they're actually the same a lot of the time. They've just been modified slightly. So I'll send them, they're like, great, you found me these 8 resources, but really it's only 2.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if those changes aren't reflected in the material themselves, yeah, it can be really difficult, especially I think for a lot of librarians or instructional designers, folks who are helping with this work, because we don't tend to be subject experts, so we're not going to necessarily go through the whole text and see what has changed and what has been reflected. I think one of the things that can be challenging too in the versioning conversation is that most of the tools don't have options for adapting it within that platform. And so as soon as folks are finding something that's useful and they're taking it outside of it, then you kind of lose control about kind of tracking where that thing goes, which can be really difficult. Challenging to find content for multidisciplinary areas like cultural studies. Yes, absolutely. For those things that don't kind of fit neatly in a box. It's one thing to say I'm looking for a biology textbook, one thing to say I'm looking for kind of a cultural studies resource. Much more challenging for sure. Yes, to Nick's point too, one of the incentives for faculty to create and share back is to track where their work goes. So having an impact, if you think about kind of the scholarship of teaching and learning, if you think about conversations that are happening around altmetrics too, one of the things I think about a lot is like, okay, we're tracking where kind of the journal articles are going, but wouldn't it be really cool if we could also bring OER into this conversation about altmetrics? No idea how that would happen, but I think that's a really rich opportunity for discussion to happen in that area for sure. I know it can be challenging too with some of the repositories, thinking about BC Campus, thinking about eCampus Ontario, that those different versions or adaptations, or who has adapted them and is using them, is not necessarily reflected as well for a whole host of reasons. I'm not making a value judgment about that at all, because I understand some of the hesitancy that faculty have, but I think that also adds to more of a challenge around finding who else is kind of using and changing these resources as well. If we at least had an idea of who was using them, we could at least start those conversations and try and figure that out. Okay, so maybe Lise, you want to kick off the next? Oh, one more comment here. Access to wraparound resources. Lumen, also a challenge. Yes, to Nick's point too. Yeah, it's challenging with those kind of content providers like Lumen, who are providing things that are similar to open, but also cost money, and so kind of exist in the open space in terms of using some of those open resources, but are also kind of bundling value added content around it to kind of mimic some of the stuff that traditional publishers are doing. Ooh, I like that idea, Dana. Creating an ethical access list of texts. So, you know, publishers who are sensing opportunity in a crisis, but figuring out how we can kind of advocate for kind of increasing the exposure who are to publishers who are kind of doing a little bit more. That's awesome. Not my idea, but fab idea for sure. That's cool.
Yeah, we're totally open to other people's ideas. If they're not on the call, who's going to say it if you don't?
Very true.
So, okay, that was great. I think there's a lot of agreement, a lot of potential for improvement. So let's move on a little bit. And this is for those of you who either create content or facilitate the deposit of OERs into repositories. So where are you currently depositing OERs, or where do you recommend that creators deposit their OERs, and why? So what informs this decision, and is findability of the resources part of that decision? And what about aggregation? So big loaded question, kind of a 4-part there.
At UBC, we suggest that there is the one kind of archival space for the object. So we do talk about our own institutional repositories, although there's several issues that we can unpack with that particular pushing of that resource or that tool, because I don't think it's set up well for open education at all. So we do suggest that, but then the sharing of the metadata out to wherever they can share the metadata out. So like OER Commons and Merlot and all the other spaces. So that's kind of the suggestion that we have, is that there should be at least one space, but just like disperse in order to get the higher impacts. And we also try, if it's a textbook, to make sure that it's inside of the catalogs, the textbook catalogs. So we try to follow suit with making sure that it fits within the textbook collections so that it can be added to like BC Campus and all those other places.
And I'll mention that Erin is actually coming back to this series in 3 weeks and is going to be giving a webinar on how to make your OERs as findable as possible given the current system. So it's kind of a follow-up to this session. I'll mention it again at the end of today, but she'll have lots of great tips for us and maybe some answers to some of our questions today. I don't know. We'll see how fast she can work. But I'll mention, I see Jean-François, merci, mentions that on one of their guides, they have a list of recommendations on how to find OERs in French. Alors, très utile sur le site web de l'Université de Montréal, de la bibliothèque. Sur un de leurs guides, ils ont des propositions pour comment trouver des REL en français. So, very useful. Dana mentions the IR, and that's what they're using for deposit of OERs. Again, IR is mentioned by Lindsay at Mount St. Vincent. Nick says that for open text, we use Eco Library, and we'll do the same for items we can add to like H5P. I guess the format certainly may impact where one deposits. Dana is interested in PKP Open Preprint Server for versioning and other workflow possibilities. That's interesting. Lindsay likes to privilege Open Textbook Library. I guess you can read that. And that's based on the uptake of reviews. So yeah, that's a good point. Faculty are interested in reviews, and is that part of your decision making? Jeff at Dalhousie mentions they use their Pressbooks, IR, BC Campus. Here, well, Isabelle a envie de parler. Vas-y donc, Isabelle.
Hello. It's going to be quicker than type everything. You remember in January, I mentioned a feasibility studies about building a repository for Quebec for higher education, both for searching and both for deposit. The project is going further, and it's part of the Plan d'Action Numérique. So today we have Pascal Blanc, that is one of the partner in this project. They have this meta searcher that is called Ceres. It's a meta searcher built on LOM, and it's been many years that it's working. And they have this project to make another version, more semantic web actually, and we are working with the France for that on the latest standards. So if you have questions on that, we are available.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And we'll have a slide on metadata standards and the role of metadata in this whole discussion coming up. And I think we can perhaps bring that up again. But that is an interesting model. And I'm curious whether there are any other portals or kind of aggregated searches within Canada. I mean, obviously we know that there are some provincial databases. I think of the eCampus Ontario collection, as well as the BC Campus open textbook collection. Are there other Canadian aggregation or multi-site search tools? I'm seeing, sorry, I'm catching up on the chat. I see there's definitely, so eCampus Ontario, people are sending to BC Campus as well. Sharing metadata with public libraries, interesting. Yeah, that looks like something that could be a webinar in itself.
I would say for Canadian tools, I haven't found one, and if somebody has one, please share. But I think the issue with that is that identifying the Canadian content in open education resources really isn't there yet. So it's almost like this is a metadata issue, is that it would be phenomenal if we could just add to the metadata that this has a Canadian content, like CanCon, put a little maple leaf or something, so that when somebody says, I want sociology with a Canadian perspective, that I could do that. Now, one part of that might be is that nobody is creating enough of this content, like it's just not hit a tipping point. I'm not sure, but that's almost every faculty member is like, I want food and nutrition, but I want Canadian because the policies and regulations around food is different here than in the US. And so, and this is where adaption comes in, but definitely it's an issue if we can't even narrow to that.
Well, and I was wondering about aggregating the content that is being deposited into our IRs that is specifically OER content. I mean, I think we're already not quite there in terms of aggregating IR content in general. So even just limiting it to OER is an even bigger challenge. So Isabelle can maybe tell us whether the IR content is being represented in the CERES search. I'm curious about that.
The higher education content?
Non, désolé. Le contenu, est-ce qu'il y a des REL qui sont dans les dépôts institutionnels qui sont représentés là-dedans, ou est-ce qu'ils sont déposés directement dans CERES? Are they?
They are. No, CERES is
aggregator.
Aggregator.
Right.
All the images, videos, and documents, they are all in all parts of the network. Let's say in Le Monde en Images, they have many illustrations in higher education for sales, videos on autodefense. So it's an ecosystem, and CERES aggregate for the moment, but we need a deposit part. So the project is to build one. You can deposit now in Le Monde en Images, let's say, but other types, let's say simulations, and we don't have a repository for those.
Oh, still very much ahead of the rest.
So Pascal posted the URL of CERES. It's bilingual, and you can search with, it's a simple advanced search, but also with Dewey. People can search with Dewey and all disciplines in college and other ontology.
Great. I think we have another question here. Oh, so, oops, I don't know what I've done there. Well, perhaps we can move on to the next question, which is, if you are in one of these provinces that has an OER or open textbook repository or database, how useful do you find that? Is that a model that you appreciate? If yes, why? If no, why not? Absolutely, use it all the time, says Nick. Anyone else? And so once you searched BC Campus and look beyond that, do you find duplication, or do you find that that your local provincial resource is very different in content? Hubert mentions that, yeah, having a provincial tool is really helpful for instructors. It really saves them a lot of time in finding locally sanctioned or created content. Brenda mentions that this is where finding Canadian content is a lot easier. Nice branding, yes, well, that's good. Well, lots of really positive feedback about both the eCampus Ontario and BC Campus collections. Yes, we'll have to pass that info on for sure. One thing I was curious about is whether you find that you do have to go then beyond, if you're looking for for a specific topic. If you find, how frequently do you find yourself searching in either eCampus Ontario or BC Campus, but then finding that you also have to go to another database for some reason? Always, okay. Basically all the time.
I think also, though, is that we've basically said here what is a problem, which is that there are open repositories, but the repositories are focusing on, at least the good ones, a lot of the time are focusing on the textbooks, which is great, but the fact is that open is beyond the first year, second year experience. So I'm trying to work with faculty that are farther down the road, that are like wanting test bank questions or ancillaries of some sort. And these tools don't actually help me in the end. So I'm back to the old trying Merlot, OER Commons, Google searching as best as I can kind of situation.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I guess I was curious whether the possibility of having the same textbook appearing in both eCampus Ontario and BC Campus and other databases, of course, whether that complicated things yet again in terms of versioning or authoritative or order of versions or whatnot.
Just too hard to type it all. I think, yeah, it does. The issue is that each system is slightly, well, not even slightly, is different. So it kind of causes a bit of a level of distrust that you're actually being as thorough as we want to be. Whereas when I'm inside of like publisher databases and that, I feel a confidence level because there is a lot of backgrounding information that tells you what is happening in the searching, what's exactly contained within inside of the content, the metadata structures. That's not the same with the open content, because the open content has been strung up by a lot of goodwill a lot of the time. So now we're kind of done things a bit backwards in a way. We built content and now we're trying to build a structure over top of the content to find it.
I've just learned that ECO stands for eCampus Ontario. So I've learned something here. I won't call it ECO again. Yeah, no, some really interesting comments, some more great reference information about CERES. And yeah, also interesting point that eCampus Ontario is built on DSpace. Did not realize that either. So perhaps we can move on. I know we've still got a bunch more questions for you. And I think, Ali, am I still doing this one as well? I think so. Eh?
Yeah, it's you.
All right, so I figured there's got to be some people on this call who are knowledgeable about metadata and can support us in this area. Not my forte, but here's a question for you. Basically, we're trying to get at where does metadata come in to this discussion? So if you manage or support deposits into a database, who is it that inputs the data? Is it the creators? Is it staff, students? And what kind of support are they given in this area? Either through the interface, through support materials, through training, etc. And how does that work, I guess? How is that working for you? And if you want to talk rather than type this in, feel free.
For UBC, it's kind of a partnership. The faculty will provide a sense of what they would like for the metadata, but we give them a structure of what that metadata should look like, so that they have a good sense of that. In terms of the actual input, the faculty is not doing the inputs. I think this is a big problem, other than the metadata not being necessarily well-structured metadata. That's a different issue. But I think that it's a barrier from going from having an object and getting the object available in open access, that if there isn't somebody assisting through that process, it's less likely that it's going to go anywhere.
Yeah. So Nick says that it's usually the development team or librarians, not so much faculty. Beth tells us that the creator completes for eCampus Ontario. The creator completes some of them, but then we've got Lillian doing much of it. And I guess I'd be curious from Pascal and Isabelle whether the metadata in CERES is coming straight from wherever it's being aggregated from, or does CERES do any metadata cleanup on any of its content?
Est-ce que c'est correct si je parle en français? Oui. Lise, tu feras la traduction aussi bien.
Tenter, mais la traduction des...
Donc, CERES, à l'heure actuelle, ce qu'il fait surtout, c'est qu'il moissonne différents repositories, et justement, il les moissonne avec un protocole qu'on appelle OAI-PMH. Et donc, ça veut dire qu'il va déjà aller moissonner des entrepôts avec une paramétrisation qui, justement, permet d'aller chercher les métadonnées qui respectent le format LOM, Learning Object Metadata, comme disait tout à l'heure Isabelle. Au niveau de CERES, en fait, il y a eu la création de ce qu'on appelle un profil d'application de l'OM, parce que l'OM, c'est le standard général, mais au niveau du Québec, on a adapté l'OM en un profil qui s'appelle normétique. En France, ils ont adapté l'OM en un profil qui s'appelle SUP-LOM-FR au niveau de l'enseignement supérieur. Et donc, ça nous permet à ce moment-là, justement, d'aller moissonner des entrepôts français et après d'être en mesure de les présenter lors d'une recherche sur le portail CERES. Et parfois, lorsqu'il n'y a pas donc justement un partenariat qui permet justement d'avoir établi ce moissonnage automatique, c'est au niveau de la vitrine, en fait, qu'on va faire l'entrée de données, puisque donc, comme l'a dit Isabelle, c'est un catalogue. Donc, en fait, nous, on va saisir les métadonnées de la ressource et dans tous les champs de saisie, il y aura entre autres l'URL qui nous permettra à ce moment-là d'aller mettre l'URL où la ressource est hébergée.
Ok, c'est beau, merci. So if I understand correctly, for CERES, it's a harvesting aggregation tool, and that's done through OEI PMH. but using the LOM standard, which I think I mentioned, oh shoot.
Oh, c'est normétique peut-être, because
Right.
pour avoir, en fait, quand on a les standards comme Dublin Core, qui est plus connu des bibliothécaires, la LOM, c'est vraiment un standard général, et donc il faut qu'on fasse une application qui va prendre les spécificités locales. Par exemple, au Québec, on a des cégeps, c'est sûr que c'est une spécificité locale dans les vocabulaires par rapport à l'enseignement supérieur. Donc, on a fait un profil d'application de l'homme qui s'appelle normétique, qui va prendre un certain nombre de spécificités locales du Québec pour s'assurer après qu'on va pouvoir faire de l'inférence sémantique ou être en mesure d'être recherché par des francophones d'autres pays.
Okay, I'm not going to attempt to translate all that, but it is very much an international tool, so really reflecting international content. And there is some metadata entry being done based on the data available on the other sites. So, but mostly it's trying to do it just carrying over, transferring the content. So I am showing you now the other questions on this page so that you can see the other metadata standards that are either currently in place or in the process of being developed. I am curious to know to what extent, especially the librarians on the call, to what extent you know and apply these standards, if any. I know there are absolutely limitations on using or complying with metadata standards in terms of availability of human resources to input this. It's not something that we can ask faculty to input themselves when it's when we're trying to fit within these standards. So I guess I'll just see if anybody's got anything to say in the chat, or if you want to turn on your mic and talk about your experiences with this. Because we do obviously recognize that better metadata could mean, or more consistent metadata could mean, better searchability and better harvesting, but that has to be balanced with what is available in terms of time for people to input this kind of metadata. So Yvette mentions and points to some links found useful by eCampus Ontario, and mentions that very sadly, Lillian is not with us today. She could definitely talk more about metadata as being applied in eCampus Ontario, but unfortunately she's on another metadata, OER metadata call as we speak. No other metadata fans on the call? Okay, and I see that eCampus has its own metadata schema. Interesting. All right, well, we only have 13 minutes left, so I think we could probably move on to the next slide. And if anyone else wants to bring up metadata again, we certainly will not stop you.
Okay, so now big questions, looking forward. So given what you've just heard, what are your thoughts about how we, as a community of practitioners and folks doing this work, might want to change our collective practices towards maximum searchability and findability of OER? So we'll start with that question.
Maybe people are typing. Yeah. just like that, as I'm also part of Portage organizations, and I see that guides, very short guides that explain the best practices and the advantage of doing things. Let's say to describe a new version of what you took from eCampus Ontario or elsewhere, to teach the best practices of you take, you give away, and how to do that. Maybe there is not a single repository in each province, but let's make them what is existing more visible, guides that they do that in Portage, where to go, and they talk to the teachers, the professors, so and give a nice idea of what are the best practices and a good voice on those best practices.
That's a great point, Isabel. More kind of support for folks who are trying to do that work and kind of having a bit of a more unified approach. Seeing some folks in the chat who are talking about having a Canadian portal rather than individual provincially focused ones. Definitely, this is something that Lise and I talked about a lot when we were preparing for this call. We were like, why don't we just do things consortially? Why does everyone have to be a special snowflake? And especially, you know, is there any way we can kind of, if we are going to do something consortially, providing resources, like rather than everyone kind of replicating all of these individual efforts at their institutions in a way that we've done with, let's say, our institutional repositories, is there any way that we could create something that's more centralized, that raises more visibility for all sorts of folks who are contributing materials to that space, but also making it easier and hopefully less kind of resource intensive in terms of if every institution either provides some sort of funding or resources in terms of kind of technical expertise and other things, that we could kind of do this in a bit more of a sustainable way than everyone replicating these same kind of individual structures, right? Like, I don't know if other folks on the call have this problem, but I have a lot of folks who were like, why can't we make a Guelph repository? And I'm like, I understand why you want that. That looks great from an institutional perspective, but if we're thinking about kind of giving back into the commons and making things kind of more findable, is someone necessarily going to say, oh, I'm going to search through the 75 repositories for all of the Canadian institutions to find something that has Canadian specific content? Very unlikely. So I think our Lise and I think, seem to feel like our efforts are better served trying to do things kind of more consortially across the provinces, or at least having kind of a united like approach to pushing some of those initiatives forward. Putting out a white paper or a document highlighting some of the issues folks are facing around the country. Yeah, good point. Just giving kind of more visibility to some of those challenges. Something similar to Dataverse, so Canadian-wide resource. Dana says, distributed network approach to a national portal. Yep, okay, so Judy also agrees with that. Everything you were saying is amazing, Ali. Oh, thank you. Yeah, Kate raises a really good point too in terms of finding out more information about what folks are actually using too. So not only the visibility and folks being able to find those resources, but also in terms of understanding how many folks are using them. I think certainly for faculty, that use point is huge. They want to see what their peers are doing at other institutions. So if there's a way to make that more visible and more obvious, I think that would be really helpful.
Yeah, I think Hubert mentions that while a good idea, it's likely that the reason we have these provincial portals is that funding for education tends to be at the provincial level. And so not terribly surprising that that's how it's happened. But still something that we can work on. And yeah, there's future there. I mean, there's lots here that I think the Open Education Working Group can keep talking about. And I think we'll definitely be bringing all of this information back to that group to digest and talk about some more.
Dana asks if this is a distinct portal project or part of a broader cross repo one. Lise, do you want to answer that? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, yeah, that's very interesting. I guess it depends, and it certainly the idea of a cross repo or some way to search across repositories in Canada is top of mind at CARL. We have another working group, an Open Repositories working group, that is looking at that question. Yeah, we're working with OpenAIR to try and get Canadian repositories content included in OpenAIR. But in terms of, we're also talking about the possibility of setting up a national instance of a repository, and makes sense that if that's even a discussion, that it could involve OERs as well as, yeah, as well as articles or other typical IR content, because not all Canadian IRs at this point contain OERs as part of their collections mandate. So many good ideas.
Lise, there's a French comment in the chat box. Do you mind just translating it?
There are lots of different initiatives currently underway. So it's difficult to know who's doing what and making sure that there is no duplication of effort. Absolument, Valérie. No, that's a big part of it. So the CARL working group has been focused on librarians and, kind of uniting that our experiences, but there absolutely needs to be work across the different groups that are involved in OERs. Clearly, we have eCampus Ontario represented on the call today. We do work with BC Campus. Faculty and students are other really important stakeholder groups. So yeah, I absolutely agree. Carl's not going to go off, or the OEWG is not going to go off and solve this. It absolutely has to be a collaborative venture. Just going to look at the other message from Pascal. Yeah, so Pascal mentions that it's also important to think about what the use of the OERs is, and I suppose in relation to the search. So with textbooks, it's much more straightforward, but when it comes to other types of OERs, it's not necessarily as clear. So it can, I guess the use can be at very different, in very different levels or parts of the educational process.
So I'm cognizant here that we only have a few minutes left. And so maybe my last question is if anyone knows of any groups that are doing work to kind of advance this. It's really a shame that Lillian is not on the call today, because I do know that she's collaborating with folks at Spark and a number of other organizations to kind of have more of a shared conversation about metadata specifically and how we can kind of support that as a community. So fortunately, she's not here to chat about that, but I'm sure if you reached out to her, she'd be happy to talk about it. If you have any other suggestions or insights, maybe throw them into the chat if you feel comfortable.
And I'll be very quick. I see there's still lots of ideas and questions coming through. I see from Anne that she's interested in knowing which OERs actually do include, or sorry, which IRs include OERs, and how does that fit into your collection policy? And that's a really good point, and perhaps an area where the ORWG could come in. So I will follow up with you there, Anne. And yes, and we are seeing a comment from Eric that Michael McNally has led some discussion on the OER Canada list about federal funding, federal support, findability, and this idea of having the different stakeholder groups working together. So yes, I absolutely, we're in touch with Michael a lot, and I think that's an area that needs to continue happening, or we need to continue those discussions. But very, very quickly, thank you all for being here with us today. We really could have had another hour, I think, of this discussion, but on the screen you can see the link to the CARL upcoming webinars and community calls. That's also the page where we list past calls that are available as recordings. So yeah, lots and lots going on. Don't want to keep you past the hour. We've all got busy schedules, but thank you all for being here. Merci à tous.